Welcome to GeekGirlCon Book Club. My name is Miriam. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a Twitch content producer for GeekGirlCon, and I'm wearing a black scarf, glasses. I have black headphones and a mic on, and I'll pass it on to Christina.
All right, awesome. I'm Christina, pronouns are they or she. I am also a content producer on Twitch team. And I forgot about the visual descriptions again. I've got plaid on and glasses and headphones. Nothing too outstanding, but Julia.
Hi, I'm Julia, she, her. I have headphones, I guess glowing green at the moment, and just black over the ears. My hair is down and long and kind of reddish blonde, and I have a nice little black sweater thing that's slightly off-centered.
Awesome.
Cool.
Yeah.
Do you want me to introduce the book we're reading?
Yes,
Um,
please.
So today for book club, we will be talking about Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. There's a book on this, there's a show, and I think there's might be one more something based off of this book as well. I can't remember. But yeah. I don't we haven't decided who would give the summary for this
I
book.
realized that after we went live. I was like, oh yeah, I was gonna ask if somebody wanted to take that one away or not. Julia, do you feel like you could do a good
I'd
summary
be
of this?
happy to.
That would be awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, so
Thank you.
Kindred, I think, has probably one of the most interesting premises of any science fiction novel ever. It starts in the 70s, which would have been the modern day for when it was being written, where there's a young woman, Dana, who's a black woman who's engaged to a white man, Kevin, when suddenly she vanishes from her normal, everyday world into the antebellum South, where she is now a modern black woman on a slave plantation. And she very quickly learns, she saves a little white boy who's in danger from drowning. But she very quickly learns, or puts together, I should say, that he's in fact her ancestor, Rufus, right? Sorry, I'm probably getting the last name wrong.
Yeah,
And that Wayne,
Waylon.
that was it, yeah.
Okay,
Wayland,
Waylon.
that was it.
Yeah, yeah.
Rufus Wayland. And she is being sent back in time to save him, and if she fails, she'll probably never exist. Meanwhile, the only way she can get back from the antebellum past is if something happens to her where she's so scared and so afraid that she feels like she's in danger of death. So she goes back and forth between her modern world and this, really horrifying world, all the while knowing that in this horrifying world, she has to save a little boy who slowly but surely grows up in a culture that really is very, very toxic.
Mm.
So she kind of starts with, he's this sweet little boy who might be a little off because, what child wouldn't be, to a young man who is an antebellum slave owner and who she knows will someday create, sire, I guess, her ancestor. And her initial hopes, of course, when she's there the first time and sees a sweet little boy she has to save, is, of course, he'll just fall in love with a black woman. But of course, as we all know, that's even if that was what happened in the story, the dynamics for that would be not really appropriate to the modern era. And of course, that's not what happens. Her ancestress does not fall in love with Rufus, which makes the story harder and harder to read as it continues, where you go from maybe there's some hope that, Dana can see in her ancestor this great man. But in fact, he's a monster.
Mm.
You also end up with that as time goes by, her white fiance is also sucked back in time. And so there's an entire period too where she has to figure out really even how do they adapt together, because clearly in this antebellum world, she can be his belonging, but she can't be his potential wife.
Mm.
So,
I did forget some disclaimers, content
Ah,
oh yes.
disclaimers
I
earlier.
forgot to. Yep.
But there are some topics that we will be discussing and that this book also covers that might be triggering or considered sensitive topics as well. Just to put that out there as an FYI. I'm not sure if there was anything else, Christina, you would want to add.
Yeah, I wasn't sure. Like, I think it's just they're, very mature, very difficult and challenging topics that involve trauma, assault, sexual assault. There are a number of these things. I will list them just in case there are specific triggers for people. But yeah, there, and obviously racism in every variant of that. So yeah, just to be warned and know, that we won't be graphic or anything, but that we will, these topics will be covered. Yep. Yeah. So, do we kind of want to start with like impressions and then like go from there, or get right into questions that we have, or?
Well, I can start off with impressions. First of all, thank you, Julia, for that awesome summary. To be
Yeah,
honest,
that
I
was
wouldn't
great.
have done it any better than you did. Um, and then as far as like for first impressions go, so sometimes I like to go into books blindly, not knowing what they're about, who the like haven't read like the author's previous works, and let's just say the first chapter was really oh a weird experience for me because the first chapter is kind of like the ending of that story. So you're just like, oh, what's happening? And I had no idea it was about time travel either. So that that made me enjoy the book a lot more. Um, and I was also trapped on a 6-hour flight, so I had nothing else to do except try to finish this book in 6 hours, which I did. Very impressed with myself, to be
Nice.
honest.
Yeah.
I thought I'd be sleeping for 6 hours now. Sleep deprived Miriam apparently can read a book. Um, and I actually enjoyed the whole so I read books about time travel and, read about how heroes or the main character time travels to the past and is trying to fix the past. But here it's very interesting because slavery is the big major problem and like the root of a lot of problems the main character faces in her travels through time in the past. But she does acknowledge and she does realize that, oh, this is part of history and there's like not much I can do to actually change it. I can't revolutionize the whole continent and make everyone rethink their ideas and um their thoughts and rules about slavery. So that was a very interesting take where Olivia Butler was like, this is part of history, and the main character has a descendant from group of people who were actual victims of this horrific part of our history. And she goes back in time to those ancestors, and yet her influence is only limited. And she realizes how limited her influence is and how she kind of builds her goals every time she travels back and what her goal is, even if sometimes she faces really difficult decisions where she's like, oh, I really, I don't know if I can spoil this, but I'll just go ahead. Difficult decisions like, oh, I really don't want to save my ancestor Rufus, but at the same time, I have to save him in order to actually exist in the present world. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that one was an ongoing thing. And this is I was just saying to you two before we started, I had some questions where I was like, oh, so why did this happen this way? One thing I was like, okay, I see now, I understood that she had to do this. Like her very livelihood was tied to this person's life. And I think early on, like Julia said in her description, he or sorry, Dana, the main character, like felt like this little boy could be saved or guided on the right path, and she could see that as a child he was just imitating what he'd been taught. But it definitely becomes harder and harder because she has to make more and more morally ambiguous decisions to sustain her own lifeline, and it reaches a point where she's like having to do things that are putting other people in a lot of risk, and it's like at what point, at what point does she have to make a really, really difficult choice, which kind of happens, like, I think later in the book, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, impressions are this almost feels like a book that I wouldn't say is really enjoyable per se, because I mean, but it's very interesting. I mean, it's one of those books I think that really sticks with you for a long time after reading it. Um, and one of the things I really, I guess, appreciated about all of it is that, um, you know, while things are horrible in the book, Butler, I think, does a really good job too of making it never feel cartoonish or ridiculous. It always feels like, okay, like Tom, the father of Rufus, who is never painted in a particularly good light, really sees himself as a decent person. And you can even at some level see how he would see that. He only beats his slaves when he feels that he has to. He, makes sure they eat enough. He gives them treats. I mean, it's really interesting looking at this horrifying situation and yet going, even the characters who are unsympathetic don't feel like they're, twirling their mustache and going, ho, 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 now I've tied this person to, the train tracks and I'm waiting for the train. They all feel, their levels of evil are very believable. They're very explained. And
Mm.
in many ways, the evil is less the individual people than it is the system they're in that allows humans this level of power and control over another human life, that allows, if you're having a bad day, you can take it out on a slave, or if, you know, and I mean, to me, that's almost what makes it so hard to read is, if all of the characters were just going, whoa, I'm the worst person ever. I, like shooting people for fun and drowning babies and, pools of water. I think it would be a much less challenging book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. It's something where I will say that, yeah, absolutely agree with that she does do a good job of portraying all of the things that lead to people behaving the way they do and doing horrible things, where it's like, this is a system of an intergenerational trauma system where the system and the context that you're raised in contributes to how you approach and react to the situation and how you treat people. And, like, she wasn't alone strong enough to stop Rufus from being really, really sickened by the world that he lived in and the kind of people that were raising him and the things he was seeing modeled in the life around him and the way they treated other human beings, because he wasn't taught that they were full human beings. And sadly, so yeah, I 100% agree. She never makes it seem like it never seems like they're just this fully divorced from reality villain, for sure.
Um, well, should we move on to some of the questions?
Sure.
Whichever question.
Okay. Do you want to do
We
okay.
could do the time travel mechanic.
Oh yeah. Let's start there really quick. Yeah. That this is our month of time travel and it is Black History Month, so this book is like a intersection between our two themes this month on Twitch channel. And so, we this is a different pretty different time mechanic or time travel mechanic, I feel like, but also similar in some ways. So, like, what did you all think of it? Like, what do you think of the time travel mechanic used in the book, and how is it different from or similar to time travel in other media?
Julia, do you want to go first
Sure.
or?
I mean, I think it's very different than, I mean, you see so many time travel mechanics where the whole idea is I'm just going to go past and, look at things or hang out or have fun, or, alternately, as I think, was it Christina or was it Mary? I'm sorry. But one of you mentioned that, it's often I go back and stop this bad thing from happening and therefore the world changes. Whereas in this case, in many ways, Dana's whole job is to stop something from happening, to change the past, to stop Rufus from dying. Because, of course, if he dies, then her whole entire family no longer exists, which, she, needless to say, doesn't want to happen. So it's very different. It's also very personal, I think. Like, so many time travel books have this almost like, I'm going to, kill Hitler and, save the world or whatever. Then the Holocaust will never happen or whatever. Whereas, this is, which is a very, high minded and good goal. Like, I think we would all like the Holocaust not to happen. But, it's also a very high level sort of, goal and thing to do. Whereas I guess to me, saying I'm going to save my ancestor, and then on top of that, I'm also going to be stuck living in this horrible era is much more personal, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I think for some of the interesting parts of like the whole time travel mechanics in this book was when one of them is when Kevin is trapped in time and his perception of that time slowly changes and how he adapts to that time and how he interestingly tries to actually make a difference and in the ways that he can. If I remember correctly, during those 5 years that he's trapped in the past, he actively tries to help protect slaves, and help those who are escaping from the South find some safe haven in the North. Correct me if I'm wrong, because it's been a while since I read the book, but and how Dana's goal when she's there is like, oh my gosh, I have to save this spoiled kid from dying every time, and tried to reason with him and stop him from making bad decisions, while all at the same time suffering and being thought of as barely as human, which is like a theme that's not very often explored in other time travel media. Usually it's like, oh yeah, the main character might feel out of place, but it's not like um their race or uh how they identify as or who they identify as is being persecuted in a very horrific way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is one thing that stands out, and maybe I'll just kind of let people know a little more about that. I forgot to like lay out the time mechanic, their time travel mechanic, is the general premise of it, or maybe you did in your description. Sorry, but the general premise being that she's tied to him, and anytime he's in trouble, this boy, she pretty much gets summoned back, and then the fact that like it doesn't work both ways. He's not summoned to her when in her times of pain and suffering. She is summoned to his aid. And yeah, it's just a very unique. It's definitely uniquely intertwined with her own history, and it's definitely a good allegory for how these things in the past affect the present, because she experiences this helplessness and hopelessness of that a person fully subject to the whims of this person who, yeah, as you said, is not treating them like a person, and she's trying to protect herself. She had, as a modern day woman, or semi-modern, I guess 70s modern, she had not experienced a white person beating her, or a white person doing like sending her to a bed with fleas, or or with a bunch of like on a floor or something, like all of the terrible things that happen, or assault. But yeah, like there's these ties to what her ancestors had to go through, and this very real experience that she has throughout.
Well, and the mechanics very different too, in that not all time travel books, but a huge portion it's technology or magic that like the protagonist controls, whereas in this case it's completely out of her control.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Apocalypse says the time travel felt more like a horror mechanic than sci-fi, and it's true. Yeah, it's like it's very scary whenever she's gonna get pulled back, and she doesn't know how long she'll be there.
Maybe forever.
Because the only thing that brings her back, if I understand correctly, is when she is like really, really scared, basically, and in fear of her life.
Yeah, in fear of her life.
Yeah.
Or about to die because she's being tortured.
Yeah, and so it's very different, as you said, because it's not in any way controlled by her, or in any way something that she wants to do. She just has to get through it when it happens. It's happening to her, and that's very different, because usually characters are put in a more active protagonist role in these situations when they travel through time. They at least are actively always trying to figure out how to get back to their time at the very least, and she can't really do that because she just has to survive the time she's in and keep make Rufus be alive, and then go back when it happens. do we want to, let's see, what do we got on the next one? We want to go back up to one of these questions up here. Let's just go through some of these ones here. Compare Dana's job in the present day as a temp worker with her work as a slave. Yeah.
They're the same, right? She's just thrown into things and told do them, and she kind of just does them. And it's never the same any day.
Right.
I second that. Yeah. I think the way she kind of describes her job as a temp worker, similar in the situation where it's like she doesn't get to choose what she gets to do. She kind of has to do it, but the difference here becomes like she needs it for the money. To support herself financially, whereas like a slave, you're literally owned by someone else, and if you don't do it, they'll either beat you, maybe kill you, or sell you off to another plantation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like she definitely tries to draw corollaries, but obviously the intensity and consequences that are tied to it are much more direct and real in the past and much more threatening. Because as a temp worker, there are risks and threats that exist if she has to walk away or chooses to walk away, and in some ways, it's hard for her to make that choice or for people to make the choice. But it's not. Yeah, exactly. Did you have one of these? Do either of you have another question you wanted to cover first or next?
I just wrote down a bunch.
Yeah, totally. Let's see. I guess we can just kind of go through them. They're pretty quick. Why would 20th century life seem less vivid to Dana than 19th century life? And that is referencing, I'm assuming that she felt that way in the book, right?
Yeah, they have a quote. If I can hunt it down and read it from the Little Reader's Guide if we want. It was, sorry. Give me a second, because I thought the way they phrased this was really interesting. But they have, always fun to try to hunt down things. They have, when they return to their past together, she thinks, I felt as though I was losing my place here in my own time. Rufus's time was a sharper, stronger reality.
I think part of it was that she experienced a lot more traumatic events within like the short period of time she was in the 19th century versus the 20th. She had less control over her life and what she could do and what she couldn't do. So it like coming back to the 20th century felt off what's the word? I forget. Um Unrealistic, or almost like a dream like world where it's like, oh, I'm no longer considered like someone else's property. I'm no longer forced to do things I don't want to do. I'm no longer like not as um, treated not as human, or not as like a person of my own. I think that's part of it, but I'm not sure if that's like the whole picture.
I don't know either. And I mean, to me, it always struck me as kind of, in large part, because of the mechanics of the time travel, if you will, that she only goes one way when Rufus is in danger, and she only goes back when she's in danger. It almost feels as though the past is, I mean, I hate to say a highlights reel, because I don't think that's quite the right word, but it's certainly a most dramatic moments reel. You figure almost certainly the plantation had years at a time that pass where Rufus isn't getting killed, because every time she jumps back, it's been years. Where it's probably not a great life to be a slave, but neither is it. The characters are clearly living from one year to the next. They're getting married, having children there. And so I almost wonder if there's some of that going on too, that it's like, a normal life. Yes, there'll be bad things that happen, traumatic things that happen, and times when maybe our lives are in danger or when we're very upset. But most of what we're doing, let's be frank, is we're cleaning our houses, we're going to work, we're just, you know, it's a 50 if it's between a 0 and 100, whereas of course she's really only being sent back when it's between a 0 and a 10. And so you're getting these like super dramatic moments. And,
Yeah. That makes sense. And I think, yeah, that ties back into what Miriam said about the traumas too, because in addition, so it's not only like these incredibly dramatic moments that she's being sent back to, they're also terrifying and upsetting, or the whole like multiple traumas happen every time she's there. And our brains are wired to remember negative experiences better than positive experiences. And so we would be, we those things are always a little more vivid in our minds, and those especially when there's survival instincts tied into that of like self-preservation, because when she would walk in the modern day world with no threats or anything, it would be like, are you sure that nothing is going to happen? Because it, like, my experience so far has been that things can be really, really bad. So
I
yeah.
think also a part of it is that she lived in constant fear of being sent back. And because she was being sent back so frequently and like sporadically, and she had no control over it, she didn't know when it would be a sudden onset. I remember in reading the book where it's like, oh, I don't want to be in a car. I don't want to be driving a car because I don't know while driving if I disappear and I go back to the past, know what will happen then. Or I think one of the last times she does travel back is when she and Kevin are getting ready to hang out with some friends, and it takes a while for Kevin to convince her to come to go with their friends. And she's like, all right, like she's like, what if I disappeared? Like, no, don't worry about it, you haven't disappeared in a while. And right as they're about to leave, guess what happens? So I feel like that also contributes somewhat to her trauma. She's like, because it's like, oh my gosh, I don't know when I'm going to be sent back to this awful place where I have to save my ancestor who, over time, uh, it's harder and harder to see the good in him. And to she does contemplate, it's like, oh, is he even worth saving at this point? But she's still like, if I want to live, if I want to exist, I have
Yeah.
to. And she has to make those difficult decisions, even if she's hurting people who are trying to look out for her and trying to help her
Well, people
during
she
the
cares
time.
about, and often also people who are her ancestors. It's like, why does she have to favor this spoiled, rich white boy over these, traumatized, hardworking, kind black women?
Yeah,
But for the sake of her existence, she has to.
right. And I think that's why I feel like anyone in that situation uh, would feel those memories or those experiences more vividly than
Yeah.
going to work or going to
Yeah.
get groceries or just
Doing data
sitting in
entry.
your yeah.
It may not help that none of her temp jobs sound that exciting.
Exactly. Very mundane type of work, but nothing like when they made her go out in the fields. I think that was like also one of the worst
Yeah.
chores. I wouldn't call it chores, jobs
Jobs,
that
yeah.
they forced her to do as a punishment.
Oh yeah. Took me a second. I thought you meant in the future life, and then I was like, wait, no. When she was, okay, I was like, wait, what temp job are you talking about? No, yeah, when she was sent into the fields, yeah, in back in the past. Uh, okay, let's see. Why did Kevin have to stay in the past for 5 years while Dana was there for less than one?
We kind of talked about this off stream too.
I think the general consensus was it's amazing how much faster it is when you're a slave that you get this isn't like the modern world than it is when you're, in the privileged position. I mean, I thought Kevin was like one of the better. I mean, all of the characters were well written, but I thought he was just so wonderful in that you can completely understand his perspective even while you're kind of wanting to slap him, where you're like, dude, no, it's not just fine being a slave. Like, come on, buddy.
Right. Yeah. He
So
doesn't
like,
see it. He doesn't see all the nuances she does.
No.
yeah, think like at first like, oh, this isn't too bad, and he has his own room inside the house, whereas she has to sleep in the attic. And he's like,
Yeah.
oh, you can come to like I can ask
Still with me.
yeah, I can ask Rufus's dad, and then, like all of that, but I feel like for her, it's like, oh, if I do sleep in your room, like what would
People
others?
think, yeah.
Yeah. So
Mm-hmm.
she's like she realizes quickly what position she's in and what decisions like
Yeah.
what consequences some decisions would lead to,
Yeah.
whereas Kevin's like, oh, it's okay, and he doesn't realize that as quickly because again he's in a position of privilege and power without really
Yeah.
realizing it at
Yeah,
first.
he treats it initially a bit like he's at a Ren fair. I mean, kind of like, look, we're all wearing these fun costumes. And you're like, no, no, buddy.
Yeah. He at that point has not had any of the experiences or seen the reality of it, and it hasn't affected anyone he knows yet at that point. And so then when it really gets serious and Dana gets beaten in front of his eyes, and then she teleports back and he's there, then he's like, I imagine that was a pretty big eye opener at that point, and that's why he gets involved in trying to help, liberate slaves at that point. Yeah, he's and he's stuck there for that period because that's how long it takes before Rufus is endangered, I guess.
Yeah.
It makes you think, if he knew that would endangering Rufus is how she got back, why didn't he endanger Rufus? But then he would have been dragging her back because for his own sake, and he didn't want to do that. So I guess I answered my own question. That would be bad.
I also think there's like a big contrast in their first experiences with time travel. Dana, when first it happens, she has like no idea what's going
Yeah.
on. There's this boy drowning in the river, and her
Mm.
first thought is, "Oh my gosh, I have to save this boy." And when she saves the boy, his mom is just beating her, and then
Mm-hmm.
his dad
Screaming obscenities at her. Yeah.
yeah, and then his dad just points a gun at her face.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas like Kevin is like he kind of knows what he's getting into because they
Yeah.
have it figured out, and he's I'd say he has a better welcome
Sure.
than Dana does, and even in her first few visits, her first few like past visits to the past. Whereas like Kevin is very very different and feels like he feels a little more welcomed than she did, or way more welcomed than she did.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and a
Yeah.
lot of that is the work that, Dana really has done, to build a relationship with Rufus, to build a relationship with Rufus's parents, as well as to build one just with, the slave community. I mean, she really, Dana's, you keep thinking, this woman is very bright. She should be doing better stuff than temp work, man. But but it's, she really does almost as soon as she gets there realizes I need to build relationships with people. I need to get them to trust me. I need to become, I need a job that's valued. That if I'm going to live in this time, I need to make sure I don't get myself in trouble. And she really does build the relationships that even by the next time she comes back, the mother is no longer like, what are you doing to my son? I'm going to kill you.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are still weird relationships with the mother, but,
Yeah. I think it definitely does a good job of highlighting all the different roles that everybody plays and their lack
yeah.
of. They all have a lack of perspective to some extent on the situation. That Dana is the only one who has the clearest perspective, I think, of anybody. But also, she too has her own biases and her own experiences that she's bringing from her time and her life that make it different to her at first.
Well, and I mean that so many of the slaves don't trust her either because she talks like a white person
Mm-hmm.
and she can read, which, of course, get some of the slaves she decides she's going to teach to read in an awful lot of trouble. So it's, you know,
Yeah.
potentially they were right to not completely trust her, that, she's bringing in these ideas and this knowledge that can get them all killed.
Mm-hmm. And it's a thing that happens to people of color so often, is that, and especially in cases where they've had, you know, colonists or anybody who has ownership of them or control of them in some way, where sometimes people have to step into roles where they put themselves at odds with their people of their own race because they are trying to survive, and they're forced to do so to protect themselves, or they're to protect their family because sometimes they have a child they're trying to protect or something. And so she was stepping into a role that did exist at the time, of people who would, would kind of oversee the other slaves, or who would, sometimes snitch to the owner, the slave owner, or things like that. And so it's definitely, she's stepping into that role, but we're also seeing like why she's doing what she's doing. So she's not a villain either, but to some of them she is, to some people there she's a villain too, because she's encouraging or enacting some of these harms on other people. Yeah. Oh, we've got some heavy stuff. Heavy stuff.
Yeah, I'm like, choose a fun book next time.
Okay, correct me if I'm wrong. I feel like maybe we've kind of covered this question here.
I think
Maybe,
so, yeah.
maybe we can go to this one. Is Rufus an improvement over his father? How, if at all, is Dana's influence evident on the adult Rufus?
For one, I could say I had very high hopes on him that were crushed by the end.
Yeah.
Um,
that would have been nice if he was a whole lot different based on Dana's influence.
Yeah, I mean, Dana really tried,
He made a good effort, yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess it's just like the amount of time she spent with him was again like so sporadic and like at like peaks of his life, I guess. Where I can see why it would be difficult to influence a child or a person as they're growing up when they have like constant um what's the word constant oh my gosh, I'm blanking.
Influence or
Influence, yeah, that's the word. Negative influence from their own parents. So I guess it would have been different if she was able to spend more time with him, but not that didn't really happen.
Yeah. I feel like like she almost starts to make headway. She explains, like humanizes herself to an extent, and I think that it's visible in some ways, but they get twisted. He get the like I'm just referring to the fact that like he for a while he's like, oh, like his interest slash obsession with Alice, to some extent it's like he twisted this humanization to like he almost is there because he's like, I want to be able to have a relationship with her, but I can't, so I'm going to be a horrible person and do horrible things. And it's like, oh no, not quite, buddy.
Yeah. Well, and to a certain extent, there's almost the question, too, at least to me, as to whether his interest and obsession with Alice originates with his interest slash obsession with Dana. So, I mean, it's very different because he always sees Dana almost as his mother, and then, of course, Alice he sees as his peer. But, of course, everyone is constantly making the comment that she and Alice look very much alike, which makes sense. Alice is her ancestor. But, there's almost with, like, the weird sick time travel logic of, like, things happen, the past happens differently, or the future is the way it is because you were sent back in the past. There's almost a question of his love and then his desire to control even Dana, which grows stronger and stronger, because of course early on he kind of wants to control her and kind of thinks he should be able to, but he's pretty willing to go, nah, she told me no, she's an adult, I guess I'm a kid, cool. But as he becomes more and more of an adult, it becomes more and more, you're going to do things the way I want because I own you. And you see that also happening with Alice, as well as, the obsession with both of them, admittedly in very different ways. But yeah, it's a very interesting and disturbing parallel where it's kind of like, well, we've got the mother and we've got the love interest, I guess, if you will. And of
I kind
course,
of
he does eventually try to, yeah. I'm not sure if that's getting into spoiler territory either.
I kind of agree with Julia. I think like one prime example from the book I can remember off the top of my head was when Dana teaches Rufus. She's like, "Yeah, I'm married to a white person." He's like, "You
Oh,
can't
yep.
black, yeah, white and blacks can't marry." She's like, "No, we can in the future." And he's like, "Oh, that's really interesting. So then I should be able to marry a black person." Like over time you can see how like that idea just twists and gets more and more twisted, and he he doesn't realize that the marriage between Dana and Kevin is consensual on both sides, whereas his and Alice's relationship is uh obsessive, possessive, and there's a few other words, but I'll not say them out loud in stream.
Oops, I can't hear you, Christina.
Oh, oh no.
Okay, it's good. We're good. I think that it's framed very much in everything that he's been trained to believe, which is like he can't understand that because literally his whole life and his whole experience is being an owner of people. And from the youngest age, they said call him Master Waylon and everything. And so he's always been the boss. He's always been the owner, even with his own mother. This is another thing
Yep.
that they point out, is like his mom is at his beck and call and whim as well as because of course
As well
treatment
as
of
his father's, yeah.
yeah, well, right, exactly, yeah. So like he's just used to what he wants he gets. That's just and so like he's just not able to conceive of that notion of other people having the ability to say no and or to not, just that he doesn't always get what he wants. Yeah, it's a rough one. Okay, let's see. Many of the characters in Kindred resist classification. In what ways does Dana explore various slave stereotypes, and in what ways does she transcend them?
I was gonna say I'm gonna let this kind of poke in my head for a second
Okay.
because the question went whoop.
Oh, okay, no
I mean,
worries.
to me, one of the interesting things is that there are all of the house slaves, and most of them, for all intents and purposes, aside from, a few examples which they're horrifyingly punished for, but, they do behave like, I hate to say proper slaves, but they behave as though they're contented with their lot, as though they're happy, and I always hate to say that, they're completely unhappy because, there are certainly moments of joy and pride and in anyone's life. Like that's true. That's true in refugee camps. That's true in war zones. It's true even on slave plantations. Times they're going, yes, I got married to the woman I love. I'm happy. My child was just born. I'm happy. So, I don't think that's unreasonable. And again, and when you see like the horrors that are inflicted upon them when they don't do what they're told to do, you're like, okay, if I knew that I tried to escape and I might be whipped to death, I would certainly, give me qualms about trying to escape. But it definitely at some level reinforces the idea of, the happy slave or the slave who's content and, perfectly okay with their life that way. But at the same time, I'd say it really rises above them, and why people aren't outwardly rebelling. You don't really expect them to be going like, "Yep, I'm going to grab my gun and my pitchfork," and even though I think there's always this fantasy of like, well, yes, if I was there, I know I would totally, get a rebellion going, and even if I died heroically, I do it with honor. But of course, realistically, most of us wouldn't. That's how institutions that are really horrible exist.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. To me, at least reading it, I'm like, okay, I get why this happens. Like, I mean, you might cause problems, but as long as, especially after all of your children are literally ripped from your arms and sold away from you, which happens to one woman in the book, but you have one daughter still here, and if you did anything or you made a fuss, you'd lose the only thing keeping you alive. So you are obedient. And they make a really big deal about that with Carrie in particular. I believe she's mute, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So intelligent that
Yeah.
yeah. But, they make a huge deal about how Carrie's existence, because everyone in life who loves Carrie basically can't rebel because they know the first thing the master will do is horribly torture Carrie to death. So, her mother tolerates having her other children taken from her. Her husband, rather than rebel or cause problems, is a good worker. It's, and it's really sick because, I mean, what kind of mother is going to let their own child die? But at the same time, what kind of mother would let their children be taken from them? And it's just such a horrible Sophie's choice that's presented to really everyone on the plantation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because the alternatives that all the alternatives they've seen or experienced or even imagined at that point in time are worse for them, because they're like, this is the best lot I can have. I could go to somebody who would be even more effed up. I could be sold off to somebody really even worse. I could get tortured. My child could get tortured. Like, there's just an endless, all they've seen is an endless, infinite expanse of terrible things. And so they're like, when they're comparing it against how bad it can get, then they have to be, I definitely wouldn't say happy, but they have to be content in a sense with where they are, in that it is the only way to stay alive and safe that they've found so far. So yeah, it's challenging because they there's no good decision for them.
I think like also the example set for example like running away and trying to escape. Like what happens to Alice and her
Yeah.
lover and in the middle of the book, and how, it takes a very long time for her to just physically recover from the trauma she faces after trying to escape. And she wasn't even owned by someone. She was
She had been
the
free. Yeah.
yeah, she had been free. And so it's just like oh my gosh, she was a free black person and she tried to run away with a slave. Look what happened to her. Now she's actually a slave because she was bought off while trying to run away. So this kind of sets an example for the other slaves, and the owners really do a good job of setting examples. It's like, oh, if you do this, and this is what's gonna happen.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if you play nicely, you get some extra pork and you get, to eat all of the leftovers after dinner and you get some new cloth for your dresses and you can marry the person you like on the plantation, but if you screw up, it's it's very carrot and whip.
Yep.
I think that pretty much like covers it. I guess I don't know, in the ways that she transcends them, the stereotypes. I mean, I think just giving them depth, like I think that's the thing, is that what we were all just talking about, the ways that the system reinforces those things. It's like, yeah, there's stereotype, but there are reasons. There's like reasons that they were, why that thing might have happened. So she was giving depth to these like tropes.
Yeah.
I guess we can do the next one. Do we in the 21st century still have conditioned responses to slavery? I feel like it's a yes in a lot of ways. I mean, we have conditioned responses to everything, right, to an extent, and I think like it's we have, there's definitely a shying away that we do in a lot of ways. We don't want to think about it. We don't want to talk about it, and we don't. It's kind of unreal to us in the way that for her the modern world became unreal. I feel like slavery is still very much a thing in the modern world, but it's now moved to back markets and illegal trade and things like that is very much happening. And we've got here in Washington, we've got a really high rate of that. And we've got, I'm sure you've seen like there's signs in the public restrooms that are like, if you're being forced into any kind of work against your will, etc., then contact this number. And so like I think we definitely have a lot of discomfort, but we don't see it in our day-to-day lives.
Well, yeah, they had, what was it, the Atlantic article that came out a few years ago about My Parents' Slave, and it was basically, I think, a Filipino family where they had a woman who was sold to them, and I think he lived in the U.S. When he moved from the Philippines, this family came over along with, and he'd always thought of her as his aunt, and just that was perfectly reasonable, and it was only as he got older that he came to the conclusion that this woman was his family slave. And
Wow.
it's, if you've not read it, it's a very powerful and, disturbing article because you're really reading about somebody who, as of very recently was a slave in the United States. And
Mm-hmm.
so, yeah, it definitely happens. I think just we kind of go, I don't want to look at it because if I don't look at it, it's not there. And that,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. It's definitely a very challenging conversation to have with anyone. It's a very sensitive topic as well, in terms of like how you're talking about it, like what, you know, what can be what can be done about it. Now for like the illegal slavery that occurs now, and like how do we um how do we uh how do we help the descendants of slaves in the US, and like how do we help them, what kind of trauma they're facing, and what can we do for them, how can we what was the word, repercussions,
Reparations.
um
Mm.
reparations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, having a hard day, sorry, it's almost 8 o'clock, so my brain's like starting to
No,
shut
I'm
down.
like you. My brain shuts off at 6 p.m. It's like I'm done now.
Well, that it is usually our wrap up time for book club stream, so that's perfect timing for our brains to shut down. uh, I do want to cover one question down here at the bottom, which was, how do you think the novel might differ if it was written today in 2023, and what factors might change how the topic would be addressed and portrayed? Because the thing is, like, she's writing in the 1970s, right? And there's still so much like that's changed since then. There's so many things.
I mean, 50 years. Well, let me see. Was it 50 years? I'm trying to think. 79. So not quite 50 years. 40 something years.
44.
Yeah.
So yeah, like I mean almost. I mean it's like almost a half a century there. You know, I mean it's
Yeah.
like it's a person's lifetime, or a large chunk of a person's lifetime.
Yeah.
So and so much we've seen so much. I mean, even just as we know in the last few years with the Black Lives Matters movement and matter. I got my plurals weird there, but you know what I'm referring to. And with just the outcry that we've had, but also just in some ways the ways that things are the same in terms of violence being enacted against Black people and horrible crimes being done to them.
It's hard to imagine it would be exactly the same just because I feel as though almost certainly at least some of those details would come up. But
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that was interesting to me, at least in Kindred, is that in the parts that are set in the modern world, I hate to say that there is no racism, there is no sexism, but they're really not brought up tremendously. Like, things are shown as almost idealistic, like we've gone beyond all of that. And my guess is that at some level, it's not that Butler doesn't believe that, partially because having read her other things she's written, I know she's very, very, very aware of, as a Black female lesbian, she was very well of sexism, racism, homophobia.
Mm-hmm.
Um, this was, none of these were things she was like, do, everything's perfect now. But I mean, I feel like that was done in large part to contrast
Mm-hmm.
to the absolute horrors of the past, that things may not be perfect in the 70s, but by God, are they better than they used to be?
Mm-hmm.
And, so there's almost a question to me as to whether it really would be all that different because, in many ways, she is trying to almost contrast this good present to this horrifying past. And I think that bringing up too much of the rest, I guess, if you will, might. I don't know. She also always struck me as a very confident author that, like, she doesn't really care what other people think. She's just going to write it.
Mm-hmm.
That just might be my opinion. But, I feel like there are writers who are very, I'm trying to catch a trend, or I'm trying to, you can tell they're always thinking about, is the reader going to be horrified or stunned? Whereas Butler, I almost feel, was like, I'm going to write this, and if you don't like it, don't read it. But that's, one opinion of many.
Right. Yeah. I I think it's just kind of like I think that some ways that I imagine, and I want to just like, it's obvious for anyone who's watching on
Yeah.
camera, but I am white. I'm very white. I want to disclaim that I don't have insight into how a Black person today would be act differently or write this story differently if they were, but I can reflect at least on some of the trends I've seen, which is that there's a little bit more um active movements in place and things like that than there used to be, and there's a more even higher expectation of equal treatment than there was even then, because I feel like they reached 70s and there was a little bit of that artificial, like you said, this portrayed as idealistic, but I think also sometimes people really were like, there was again that like contentness of their situation of like not happy with it necessarily, but well, compared to things that the way they used to be. But I think now there's a righteous and correct anger about places where things are not just, and there nobody's like, people aren't so much being like, yeah, everything's perfect and great and we accept this lot. Like they're highlighting bad things that are happening and still happening to Black people, and injustices being done. And so I do wonder if that would have been reflected if she were writing it today. Would she have more, would there be a little bit more rage or more anger being like about the injustice being expressed from Dana's character? Or just, I guess, just a question in my mind.
Would she have slapped Kevin at least once? Yeah.
Yeah, right, yeah. Which, yeah, I do wonder.
I mean, I'm surprised she didn't beat Rufus. At least earlier in the book. I was like, this kid just needs some lessons in life, which words can't portray sometimes.
Just be being more like, the evil father. Like,
I think like now we try to match what is like called match each other's energy. So how you treat me is how I'll treat you. Um and I feel like if Dana was a character from the 2020s, her I guess the way she would carry herself in the past would be a little more reflective of like, oh, how you treat me is how I'll treat you. Regardless of like some of the consequences she'd receive. Well, at least in the beginning, I'm pretty sure like the past will be the same in terms of people's ideals and morals and what they think is right, what they think is wrong. So I'm not quite sure if the ending would be any different.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think I guess like what I would say is that like there are a lot of ways in which just being an educated person, she knew that a lot of her options weren't good. She knew, well, first of all, she knew that his fate was tied to her fate. Second of all, she knew that like changing the events of the past very like by doing that might just be futile, and it might the best possible chances that it like
obliterator.
yeah. So I think right from the onset, even someone in the 2020s more perhaps empowered or more aware or more educated about it would still be helpless in a lot of ways when put in that situation, because it's not like she had social media or couldn't like take video and post it anywhere and be like, this is a horrible mistreatment that's happening, let's do something, or like get a journalist like involved, or any number of things. And of course now we've also got like our own modern problems of brutality by authority, and so it's like there's a lot of corollaries where there's only so much a person can do when put into that circumstance. There's only so much power that she could have, even if she's like in a more quote unquote enlightened era. So that's there's only so much. Well, I feel like I ended that on a very sad note. I'm sorry.
But I mean, it is. I don't know that I want to say it's a sad book per se, because of course Dana does escape, as does Kevin. A lot of the other characters, I guess you have to kind of define how you describe escape. But I mean, it really is a depressing and hard to read book. I don't think it's a book with a lot of levity in it.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah. But I think that, as you raised at the beginning, like what it does do that I think is still something that we need in modern literature is actually expose some of the realities of the past that we frequently glaze over and cover up because it's uncomfortable. And like I know for me that's true. It's I normally would not pick this book, to be perfectly honest. Like I would not pick this book because I have my own past traumas, and I wouldn't want to necessarily like subject myself to that, but on the other hand, I'm glad in a lot of ways that I read, as much as I did, because it gives me a more real connection with the traumas they've experienced and how much worse theirs, have been compared to mine, and like how universal they were for a whole group of people. So like, yeah, I feel like it's one of those things that it's a big debate right now, controversy of like how much literature should we, at what age should we like introduce people to these really horrible ideas, and what should we allow to
I
be
don't know. I
seen.
read Julie and the Wolves when I was 10, and that was horrible too. So, do
Right,
any of you
yeah.
remember the midway point of that book? It was like,
It's been so long. I did read that, but I don't remember a lot. I think I know what part you're talking about. I think I
yes,
know.
yes. As you heard,
Yeah.
why she fled her small Alaska town. You're like, okay, apparently people, and I survived. That did not scar me permanently, but that was for a long time, like, a very popular book to be taught in elementary school, where you're like, oh.
Right, yeah. So I think that's a question too, is just like, that's a big debate right now, is like where, can we guide children in an understanding of these horrors that they won't repeat them without necessarily traumatizing children, because part of why we turn our brains off about these things is because, when we felt those pains, and we don't want to re-experience that. So like being able to process them in a healthy way, or being able to discuss them with mature adults to some extent, is like good. And I feel like adults need to be present for any experience a child is having of those things, at least as a personal opinion, because of the fact that somebody's got to give them insight and be there to help them. But it's basically just, yeah, there's that's the big thing that this book contributes. I think that's probably why it was so popular, because it just gives insight in a way that we don't see all the time.
That's why I really liked reading this book. Was we always learn about slavery, and we learn it was bad, and we learn that horrible things were done to people. But it's never really put into like a first person perspective, especially from someone who's like, even Dana was quote unquote from a modern era at the time when she time traveled back. And so to actually read it from a first person perspective of a black person um who has to who like who has no choice but to actually keep saving the person who um is like partly the cause of a lot of her trauma in the past as well, um was very, it was like Julia said, it's like a book that sticks with you for a very long time. And I really love books that do teach me about the past, and things that are sometimes glossed over when you're growing up, and parts of history that are you're taught there were bad, but you're not really given a very depth or insight into why they were bad, or like what were like firsthand experiences of people who were part of that era. S Yeah, I quickly like my train of thought quickly went, "Oop,"
No,
but
it was good.
that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, no, you got it. Yeah, that's absolutely. I think that was well put.
Well, and to me, what's so interesting, I guess, about Kindred really is how Dana is so complicit in everything. Because I mean, we have firsthand accounts of slaves. Frederick Douglass was a bestseller during his lifetime. We have writers like Toni Morrison, who, well, comparatively modern writers, again, have really delved into the Black experience of slavery, but most of them haven't really looked at. I mean, Frederick Douglass was always, hand in the air and, furious, righteous anger, which is, you know, part of what makes him fun to read. You're like, yeah, you go, Douglas, you tell him. But, we rarely see something where you go, why would somebody be complicit in this horrible system? And I think that's, we're even saying it's not necessarily the one evil person. It is the system, which is something that I think is so unique to Butler's take on slavery, I guess, and what makes Kindred a really incredibly unusual book.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, it's been
Yeah.
a long time since I've read Beloved or The Bluest Eye or The Color Purple, so I may be forgetting Morrison's work properly. I guess particularly Beloved would be the one that touched most on slavery. That's Yeah, the other two really didn't. Sorry. I'm like, how long's it
No,
been
that's
since I've read any
okay.
of these?
Yeah, I mean that's the thing, right? Some of those are like middle school aged again, where it was like not the book necessarily, but there were some that were like required reading in
Yeah,
not
in high school.
middle school, but
High
high
school, I
school.
think.
Yeah, high school. So there's definitely, it's been a while for me too.
Like if they had
Like
you
Color
reading The
Purple.
Color Purple in middle school, that would
That
have
would be
been
bad.
really hard
Yeah,
one to
probably
read.
bad. Yeah, or at least pretty rough for the teacher to walk them through. But yeah, I think that all in all, like, we got to keep highlighting stories where people are sharing the realities of what it is to be in a marginalized position, or or an abused or position, or any of those number of things, where, like, because if we lose touch with that, then yeah, it can be easy to be in a bubble and forget what that's like, and how visceral it is for them, because I think she was also capturing, like, what a little bit of just the trauma that's in her bones, and in her, and in, like, her, the writer, and in people like Black people today who, whose ancestors experienced slavery. Like, that's in their, it's in their, written into their histories, and every one of them has been affected by it, just in the course of their parents' lives, their parents' lives, etc. And there is a thread that connects them directly back to that time. So
And there's a thread in all of us. If you
mhm.
live anywhere in the Americas, your country is a different place than it would have been without slavery. I think that's true. Even if you're a recent immigrant, you're still coming into a country that was built on the backs of
Mhm.
involuntary servitude. Certainly for me, I have ancestors who owned slaves, like we have that documented. I also
Mm.
have ancestors one who died in the Civil War joining, even though he didn't have to fight against slavery. Now, it's really obvious which side, my family prefers to talk about because, one is a hero, the other is, probably a monster. But, I'd say that even if you can't say, yes, I'm descended from slaves or I'm descended from slave owners,
Mhm.
there's still always, the knowledge that, like, this country would have been a very, very different place. Our founding fathers, most of them owned slaves.
Mhm.
Most of the goods that lifted the Industrial Revolution, the cotton. What was the first thing to be industrialized? By and large, it were all of these factories in England that were using cotton that was coming from slave plantations.
Mhm.
The whole sugar, rum, molasses trade that really launched. So much of this is really, it's incomprehensible without slavery and the suffering of other people, which is, horrible and sad, but also.
It's true though. Yeah. No, I mean, that's the reality that I think can be really
Yeah.
hard to swallow. I think is
Yeah.
that, yeah, that is true. It's fully integrated into our country's history, and our people, like, everyone's history, like, not necessarily, I guess, well, everyone, because we're all part of the world, right?
Yeah.
And we all
Yeah.
have ancestors descending back into the past who were in some way part of some experience that, connected one way or another. And so it's just like, across the world, these experiences have been repeated
Well,
through time.
and that are
So
often unsavory. A cold truth of the world is if you're alive now and not part of some incredibly small tribe, you're almost certainly the descendant of colonizers.
mm.
Now, it may be like, if, like me, you're mostly Irish, it may be people who colonized the Isle, 2,500 years ago. But it's still, all of us have things, have ancestors who, if we had to meet them, we'd think exactly the way Dana does of Rufus, I think.
Yeah,
Which is,
I'm sure that somewhere in my timeline there are ancestors I do not want to meet. I would rather not. Man. So I guess let's. I know we don't have this question. I want to do a very quick, like, tie this into what, like, moving into the future. What can this book offer us, like, what insights can this offer us moving forward? Like, how can it inform our experience in, like, our modern life? It's kind of a wrap up question, because I kind of want to, like, I want
yeah.
to think about, like, how we can act on or think about these things or process these things, and kind of, moving forward, how it affects us.
I mean, to me, maybe even just empathy. I mean, again, to me, one of the most powerful things about this, and that I'd say is very, very different than I've seen in any other slave narrative, truly is why are people, allowing themselves to be in this? Because again, I know for me at least, it's always this, this fantasy that if somebody did this, no, I'd fight valiantly, I'd be the hero, I wouldn't just go along with this and be tortured and suffer. Yet we know this happens to people all the time. And I think it's, can I be empathetic to somebody might be in a bad situation or might not be showing a lot of agency? Can I think about what external factors and have the empathy to say, no, this isn't just them being lazy or stupid or cowardly, but rather, you know, they too would probably prefer to be the hero. It just isn't viable for reasons that are maybe even invisible to me.
Mm.
I agree with what Julia said, and to kind of like continue that, I think like um Dana shows from her perspective that people aren't aware of their situations and how bad how bad it really is. And like they it's very institutionalized in the past. Well, slavery is very institutionalized in the past. So it's like, oh, it is what it is, and um we are right, you're wrong. Like you can't have ideas that are different from like what we believe. Especially when Dana comes in to the past and she's like, "Oh, this is wrong. The way you're treating us is wrong. This is not how you're supposed to be treating us." Well, at least in the beginning. And they're like, "No, you're putting these novel and horrible ideas into our slaves. Don't want you near them. We don't want you talking about them. We
Mm.
don't want you to educate them because then they get these weird ideas of
Yeah.
running away."
Mm-hmm.
And that's like drilled into their ideals and their morals and their beliefs and like their perspective on life and what they can and can't do. And sometimes like even in the modern world we're like, oh, it is what it is and we can't really change it. And we don't realize how bad that situation or like how bad it is for other groups and minorities or the oppressed really. We don't realize we're in the oppressor role. When we
Mm-hmm.
actually are. So there's like going after this book, I there has been like a lot of like self-reflection, like how are my actions contributing to something that is oppressive, or has some sort of like oppression towards another group that is being oppressed. How am I contributing to that, basically?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because there's lots of ways in which we're complicit to reinforcing the system that's already there, that's oppressive, like you said. And yeah, it's exactly right. I think I agree completely that, yeah, the way that we can apply it is by that self-reflection and looking at how we can make changes or where in our lives we can have a little sacrifice or make a change or be active in these dissembling these systems or fighting against them. I think that it's a really good book for putting us in that frame of mind. Yeah. Okay. Well, did anybody have any further thoughts they wanted to say on the subject before we wrap up? Okay. All right. Well, this was a good discussion. That was like gave me a lot to think about, honestly. Thank you everybody for joining us in chat and listening along. And yeah, I'm honestly gonna skip the raid this time. It feels like a weird vibe to bring into